So we're up to Judges and Ruth in our Old Testament survey class. There's a couple of reasons why I think it's a good idea for us to study 2 books instead of 1. The lesser reason would be Ruth is really short, probably doesn't deserve its own full hour. What do you think the other reason would be?
Ruth is like an extension of Genesis?
Well, it happens at the same time. And we're going to talk about the relationship between those 2 books. But Ruth opens up by talking about during the time in which the judges governed. They're not in the same place in the Hebrew canon as they are in the English canon, but it fits very well with what we've been doing as far as tracing the storyline of the Old Testament. All right, let's start with the book of Judges. The setting of this book is immediately after the conquest of the land that we studied about last week in the book of Joshua. The book of Judges covers an approximately 335-year period from the death of Joshua, which is talked about in chapter 1 of Judges, until the death of Samson at the end of the book of Judges. Now, Samson is not the last judge. He's the last one mentioned in the book of Judges, but who is the last judge? Samuel. Samuel is a very transitional figure in that he's the last of the judges and the first kingmaker. Remember, he's the one that anoints King Saul. One of the issues with the book of Judges is that this 335-year time period that's covered in the book doesn't fit. If you take the reigns of all the judges and add them up, it comes out to more than 335 years. What's the answer to that apparent conflict?
More than one judge serving at a time.
Exactly. Their rules overlapped, and even the regions in which they judged in the land were in different places. Okay? So the events of the book are placed at various places within the land of Israel. I'll show you a map in just a minute. But this little timeline just kind of covers what we've been looking at for the last week and into this week. 1405 BC was the approximate date where they entered Canaan. Death of Joshua took place in 1390. 1375 is Israel's first apostasy in the land. Obviously, they've had apostasies in their history as they made their way up to the Promised Land, but that was the first one in the land. And then the period of the judges from that point to when Saul becomes king, anointed or made king by Samuel, is about 332 years. This gives you a kind of a chronological feel for what time period we're covering. This map shows you the various judges. There's 12 judges in all that are listed, and just the different points, different regions in which they govern. You can tell by it that they're scattered all over the country. Okay? The cycle of Judges. I want us to look and read even chapter 2, just because I feel like it gives a good summary of what's taking place in the book overall. Let's back up just a little bit. What is the recurring phrase in chapter 1 that sets up for what we see in the book of Judges? Okay, so that's a recurring phrase within the book of Judges itself, and a very important one, but there's something that's said a number of times in Judges chapter 1 that really explains why Israel gets in the mess that it does in this book.
Because they didn't drive out the Canaanites?
Right. Sorry. If you look in chapter 1, what they're doing is each tribe is responsible to go up and drive out the Canaanites within their particular allotment. But a number of times it notes that they didn't do that. For example, in verse 21 of chapter 1, but the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Again, down in verse 28, it came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. That was wrong, right? They were supposed to exterminate all of the Canaanites and drive them out completely. Why?
Idolatry.
They didn't want to be influenced. The Lord didn't want Israel to be influenced by idolatry. And we see that's exactly what ends up happening in the book of Judges. Because of their failure to drive out the Canaanites influence Israel instead of the other way around. So let's look at chapter 2 And we'll just read through this chapter pretty quickly, and I'll make some comments. But I think it's very important to understand the cycle that takes place, and that's what's described here. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers, and I said, I'll never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall not tear down their altars. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? And again, chapter 1 gives the background of that. Instead of tearing down their altars and destroying them, they ended up making covenants with them. They made them subject to them, to Israel, but they didn't drive them out. Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become as thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you. And it came about when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. When Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua. Again, that was what we showed on the timeline earlier, is those elders that were Joshua's contemporaries. Israel was pretty faithful through that time. And who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Now, what was the means that God had provided for that not to happen? In other words, for a generation not to grow up not knowing what the Lord had done for Israel. What were they supposed to do? They're supposed to teach their children. Deuteronomy 6, that was the means by which faith was to be passed to the next generation. Evidently, even though it seems like they were faithful in other ways, that had not happened. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, that is, the false gods of the Canaanites. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among gods of the peoples who were around them. And they bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth was another god of the Canaanites. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. We see this is a way that God deals with his people oftentimes, or deals especially with people that are apostatizing, is he gives them over to their sin. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Again, this goes back to Leviticus 26, to the curses that are spelled out there, as far as if they were going to be covenant disloyal to the Lord, then he was going to discipline them, and in this case, give them over to the hand of their enemies. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Now, we talked about this before, but we think of a judge as primarily somebody who sits in a courtroom, hears evidence, and decides between two parties. The term judges here, we'll see involves a little bit of that, especially with Deborah in Judges chapter 4. But by and large, these are military leaders, military deliverers. And their role is to come in and deliver Israel from being subject to these foreign powers. The Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. And yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned quickly aside from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord, for they did not do as their fathers. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. So God is still being faithful despite their rebellion, despite their apostasy, their covenant treachery. He's still remaining faithful to them. He's still hearing them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. He said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. That's an important part there. God is leaving the inhabitants in these tribal allotments and not driving them out as a test to see who will be faithful, who will keep covenant with him. So the Lord allowed these nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So as you read through that chapter, and then as you read through the rest of the book, you see this cycle. The generation would serve the Lord for a period of time, but eventually they would become influenced by the Canaanites that were in their land, and they would sin, they would become subject to idolatry, participate in idolatry. They would become slaves of the power that was in their land, the foreigners that were in the land. They would cry out to the Lord after a certain period of time. The Lord would hear their cry, and he would raise up a judge to deliver them. He would deliver them, and they would live faithfully again for a while. They would serve the Lord, and then the whole cycle would start all over again. And there's 7 such cycles in the book of Judges. We'll look at that in more detail in just a little bit. You look at that, and it's a 2-dimensional drawing, and I've used the term cycle. Really, a better and more accurate way to describe it is a spiral, a downward spiral, much like a tornado. And the fact is, as you got further and further down, things got worse and worse. Not only did each generation get worse and worse, but even the pool from which they could draw judges got worse and worse. And that's why you can see a guy like Samson, who had serious character flaws and a lot of problems. But yet the Lord could still use somebody like that, and he did. I mean, Samson was a scrapper, and he fought the Philistines and conquered them. But that helps explain how the character, a number of the judges have serious issues character-wise. But again, it goes to, it's related to the fact that all the people are not walking with the Lord the way that they're supposed to. And it gets worse as you progress through the book. All right, so let's look then at just an overall structure of the book. We talked about the failure of Israel to complete the conquest. Joshua had done what he was supposed to do as far as breaking the resistance all across the country, but each tribal allotment had not done what they were supposed to do in driving out the inhabitants of their own tribes. God brings judgment because of this failure. We just read about that in chapter 2. And then there's these 7 cycles of deliverance. 7 cycles of being subject to idolatry and then being delivered by a judge. And these are all the different types of Canaanites in the land. Mesopotamians, Moabites, Philistines, Canaanites, Midianites. Now, Abimelech is a little different. Who is Abimelech?
Grandson of Lot.
Okay, I don't think he's grandson.
No, it's not him.
Not grandson of Lot.
Gideon's son.
He's one of Gideon's sons. Do you remember how many children Gideon had? Direct descendants.
He was the concubine's son. Yeah, Abimelech.
Okay, but how many sons did Gideon have at all? Do you remember? 70 sons, it says. Many wives and probably concubines as well. So he had a bunch of different children. Abimelech was one of them. What was it that Abimelech did after his father died?
He wanted to hear just like the rest, or he wanted to be king?
He wanted to be king. So they hadn't even had a king up to this point, but he wanted to be king over the whole nation. Again, he's very suspect of character, and he ends up being anointed king. Let's go and look at some of that in chapter 8. Actually, let's pick it up in chapter 9. And Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, now that was just another name for Gideon. Those are the same, it is the same person. Went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and spoke to them and to the whole clan of the household of his mother's father, saying, Speak now in the hearing of the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, or Gideon, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? Also remember that I am your bone and your flesh. His mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the hearing of all the leaders of Shechem. And they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our relative. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver from the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows, and they followed him. Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men. So he killed all of his brothers except one. Killed them all on one stone, it says. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem and all of Beth Milo assembled together. They went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar which was in Shechem. Now, I won't read all the rest there. But what ends up happening while Abimelech is king over all of Israel? And I mean, they end up being delivered from him. But what is the result of his being king? It was a time of civil war between the nations, and they were killing each other. So this is just a little bit different from the other foreign peoples within the land. I'm calling them foreigners. They were in the land first, but now that Israel is in there, they were Israel's enemies. And Abimelech he was one of their own, but one from which they had to be delivered. Ammonites and the Philistines. So those are the cycles. Thinking about the picture that we looked at earlier, those are the different peoples to which Israel was subjugated at different points in time. The next major division is Israel's failure through becoming like the Canaanites. And this is chapter 17 through 21. And again, there's some horrible things in here. I mean, you read this book and there's murder and rape and dismemberment. This is where things really get the worst. And I want to read just a summary of some of this. This is taken from Paul House's book, and you'll recognize the story in general, but he did such a good job of summarizing chapter 17 and 18. I just want to read a couple of paragraphs out of it. You recall a man named Micah steals silver from his mother and then confesses the theft to her. Again, one of the other things that those writers point out is just how often they break the Ten Commandments. So already we see breaking of the commandment, the prohibition against stealing, dishonoring of parents. We see those kinds of things running through Judges. Delighted to find the silver, she dedicates the metal for an idol, after which her son hires a Levite from Bethlehem to be the priest of his idol and his household. That's a severe misunderstanding of the Mosaic covenant. That's what he says. Totally misunderstanding the Mosaic covenant. Micah thinks God will bless him because he has a Levite to preside over the worship of the idol. In the next episode, some Danites wish to conquer a quiet city, and they ask the Levite to ask Yahweh if they should attack. The idol priest says the Lord is with them. When they conquer, they're so pleased with the Levite that they take him as their priest, all the while promising him more pay and recognition. So again, the Danites are now wanting to hire him away from Micah. They threaten to kill Micah, who wants his priest back. Once settled, they worship the idol Micah's mother made. So that's basically what's in chapter 17 and 18. We get to chapter 19. Perhaps no more morally repugnant story appears in Scripture than the one in Judges 19. Once again, a Levite is prominent in the narrative. This man has a concubine who flees from him to her father's house. So this man has a concubine who goes back to her own family, to her father's house. Later they're reunited, and the couple journey through the territory of Benjamin and are given hospitality by an old man. During the night, in a scene reminiscent of Genesis 19, a mob forms, demanding to have sex with the Levite. Instead, the Levite sends out his own sex object, the concubine, and the rabble rape her all night long. It's terrible, unbelievably bad. The horror of this scene is multiplied in two ways in the morning. I'm sorry, let me read that again. The horror of this scene is multiplied in two ways. In the morning, the Levite callously tells her to get up and go when she is dead at the doorstep. And when he discovers her death, he cuts her in 12 pieces and mails her remains to Israel's elders. Now, why would he do that?
He wants vengeance.
He wants vengeance, and he evidently is very offended by what they have done to his concubine. What's wrong with that?
He shouldn't have sent her out if he did one.
Well, the way that he's treated her is just as bad as what he's trying to get on the rest of Israel for. He's outraged that the mob has killed her when he exposed her to the killers in the first place, which is what Isaiah said. The difference between his abuse of the woman and the crowd's is one of degree, not of kind. Perhaps he sends the limbs and lungs to the leaders to find out if any conscience remains in Israel. But one wonders if he has any left himself. So that's how bad the situation is. All right, that's Judges 19. Let me read one more paragraph that kind of summarizes Judges 20. Faced with the evidence of the Benjamites' atrocity, the people finally rouse themselves from their moral slumber. They demand that the killers be turned over, but their community protects them. This refusal results in civil war. It also results in the opponents of Benjamin asking Yahweh for battle instructions. God's desire to punish all Israel is evident in the fact that twice God sends the inquirers to defeat at the hand of the Benjamites. The third time, Yahweh gives the inquirers the victory. The victory requires tens of thousands of lives, however, and ends with the tribes swearing not to give their daughters in marriage to Benjamites. So again, these final chapters, 17 through 21, we see the failure of Israel through idolatry, the failure of Israel through the immorality of the man with his concubine, and the failure of Israel through war between the tribes. This is a commentary that House makes on Judges 17 and 18. Without question, these accounts portray a shocking array of covenant violations, all under the guise of normative worship. There's no doubt that the people in these stories are totally immersed in Canaanite worldviews, and that even the Ten Commandments are irrelevant to them. So it really is a situation where God has done all that he's done to get Israel up to the promised land. They go in, they fail again to do what they're supposed to do, and they, in the subsequent generation, get turned completely away from the Lord. Having said that, and having walked through that, what would you say are the major themes of the book of Judges? Judges themselves. And these are, again, military deliverers, first and foremost. What else? Apostasy of the nation of Israel, despite all that God had done for her. How quickly they're turning away from the fundamental commandments of God. I mean, the very first commandment is to have no other God before him, to recognize that he's the one true God, and they get involved in worshiping all these Canaanite gods. What else?
The covenant-keeping God is so highlighted.
Okay.
With their behavior. He's still faithful.
God is still faithful. He's doing exactly what he said he would do if they break covenant with him, and that's to bring discipline. He doesn't completely wipe them out. He stays with them as a people. Anything else? Kingship. The whole book of Judges is really preparing the way for the monarchy that will follow. Bev mentioned this phrase that occurs a number of times. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this book was evidently written by someone. We don't know who the author is. A lot of people would say it's Samuel. It's possible. We don't know. But someone, after a king had already come into place, and reflecting back to a period of time before, where they didn't have a king, and all the chaos that took place. So it's preparing the way for the monarchy. Okay. God's sovereignty and rule his rule over Israel and long suffering with them. Israel's incomplete obedience and its resulting consequences. Like Isaiah said, the judges, there's 12 in all. Some commentators divide them up into major and minor judges only because of the length of their rule. I won't read through all those names. Some fascinating characters and fascinating stories within the book of Judges. As Matt said, it's a preparation for the monarchy. This phrase, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then the angel of the Lord makes a couple of appearances in the book of Judges. Not an angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord. It's a theophany. It's an appearance of the second person of the Trinity. He wasn't called Jesus Christ at this point in time, but that's who it was. So that's an interesting part. We saw where Moses, the angel, or there was a theophany at the burning bush, and in a similar way, he's making these appearances in the book of Judges. Okay? If you were to summarize kind of the message and purpose statement of Judges, how would you say? What would you say that it is? Just trying to incorporate those themes into one sentence.
God's sovereignty and faithful care of his people.
Despite apostasy.
Despite apostasy.
That's a good team effort there.
Yeah.
God is faithful, and he's keeping covenant with his people despite their apostasy. I mean, the very fact that he's listening to them and sending judges to deliver them, it said he had compassion on them even after they had become immersed in idolatry. But did you have something?
Well, it's not really stating that. I mean, his word is true. Like, if he tells them to wipe out the Canaanites, there are consequences to be suffered if you don't do it. And there are blessings to be had if you do obey.
Exactly. That was all. And they should have been well familiar with that. That was an essential part of the covenant. They've been told that by Moses and Joshua, and yet they went for the bad side instead of the good. Israel's failure during the time of the theocracy, and when I say theocracy, it makes note of the fact that there wasn't a king, there wasn't a monarchy. Who was their king? God. That's the way God designed it. Now, his rule was mediated through men like Moses and Joshua and the elders. And even after the elders passed off the scene, the priests were still the means by which they could hear from God. The priests could ask questions of God. And he was the means by which, or the priests were the means by which they got revelation from God. But he was going to be their king. And if you have a king like God and somebody who's able to do battle the way that God is, why would you want a human king? They weren't content with that. So it does provide the background and demonstrates the need for a righteous king to lead the people. All right? That's the book of Judges.
Frank, there's no excuse for their apostasy. And it's easy to sit back and see how ridiculous and evil it was. But they didn't have the scriptures in their own hands like we do. They had the priests to teach them.
That's right.
But that broke down.
Right.
And, with a completed canon in our own hands, we're in such a better position.
We are. And I think we have a higher accountability because of it.
We do.
Yeah. It's very easy, like Charles said, for us to look back and say, how in the world could they do that? But let's look at our own selves. How in the world do we do what we do in light of God's done even more for us? And we have the canon. That's right. We have the access to all that he has done through his word. We have the Spirit of God dwelling in us, which is not something that they had in the same way that we do. So it's a very hard book to read on one hand because of how graphic it is and because of just how evil it is. But it's a very important book to recognize that, you've got to stay faithful to the Lord. You've got to, as Bev was saying, do what he commands you to do. You're going to suffer the consequences or reap the rewards one way or the other.
Frank, Do you think that the statement is true? I've heard Bible teachers say this, that human beings, because of our sin natures, are capable of any evil.
Yes. I mean, again, you're talking about believers and unbelievers?
I guess it would be, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you look at David, for
Yeah.
example. This is a
What was
man.
it, what, any what? I didn't hear the question.
So,
Capable of any signs in your last word.
of anything as far as evil goes.
Got it.
Yeah, any kind of sin. And I would say yes. I mean, even a man like David, who was a man after God's own heart, you look at once he started down that path, it's amazing what he was capable of doing. Now, the good news is that with David, he recognized it and he repented.
Mm-hmm.
He turned. Look at a New Testament example. Saul, Saul as an unbeliever was persecuting and putting Christians to death. And then, certainly God works to sanctify us, and we'd like to think that as we grow in the Lord, we're less and less inclined to some of these horrendous acts. But it happens. It ties back to what we were talking about earlier this morning, is Satan continues to try to lure us down that path. And so, now I don't want to say that a Christian and a believer and an unbeliever are on the same ground as far as being able to commit evil, just by virtue of the fact that the Spirit dwells in us and we're sanctified in the truth. But believers can be capable of bad things as well, and that's why it's our responsibility to put on that armor and to fight against temptation.
The longer you stay in sin, unconfessed sin, the worse it gets.
That's right. Yeah. David even talks about that in his Psalms, when he didn't confess his sin, he was groaning in his bones. And I think the longer, if you start to cover up your sin, you feel like you got to keep covering it up. That's basically what he did. So, boy, it's important for us to keep short accounts of the Lord and to, as Bev was saying, just be obedient to his word. I mean, what we need to do is clear and not that complicated. But because of the power of the forces of darkness, because of our unredeemed flesh, it's not something that necessarily gets easier over time. I think we mature in the faith and we're able to fight better, but it's not like the battle gets easier.
When Satan can take you by surprise
Exactly.
or temptation.
Exactly. That's right. It's happened to many a person. It can happen to any of us. Absolutely.
Take heed if you stand.
That's right. Yeah. We have these warnings, these admonitions of Scripture to be vigilant, to be watchful, and not to think that we can rest on our laurels in any way. It's a good point. All right, so the interesting thing about Ruth is that it takes place in the time of the Judges. It's a very different kind of story than Judges is. It is, you could make a play out of Ruth very easily. And so, as in a play, you have key players. Elimelech is from Bethlehem. He's the husband of Naomi. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. That whole family ends up leaving Bethlehem. Why?
There's a famine.
There's a famine in the land. So where do they go?
To
They go down to Moab, which is kind of east and south of the Dead Sea. Why do you think there was a famine in the land? They weren't obeying. It's the time of the Judges. God is doing what he said he would do. He's closing up the skies so that they don't have food to eat. The other main player in the story is Boaz, who we're told is a kinsman of Naomi. A kinsman actually on the side of Elimelech's family. The setting, according to chapter 1, verse 1, is in the days when the judges governed. And again, because of the famine in Israel, Elimelech took his wife and his sons down to Moab, primarily to get food there. So let's walk through this a chapter at a time. First, we learn
Can I
of
ask a
Ruth's.
question?
Yes.
Would you say that their family believed in God and knew who he was at that point?
I would, because of the way that they act as the story unfolds. Now,
So why did they marry?
that's a good question. That was something that was forbidden for them to marry Moabite women or any of the women in those other nations, I think you can understand it or explain it better with Boaz. With the sons, I don't know enough about when they took the woman, what they did. There's another place in the law that talks about when they come into a territory and they capture the land and the people, and if there's a woman among them that they want to take as a wife, they have to go through this long procedure. For what purpose?
Temporary, so that
What?
want to be a foreigner amongst some of them, I don't know.
Well, that's right. I mean, what they're basically doing is calling her to be separated from her gods and her past and to join the house of Israel. So it seems to me, I thought about this question this week because it seems to me if a woman is willing to embrace the God of Israel, then that she becomes an Israelite. Well, not exactly,
So
but she...
basically, if that person believed in God, then he wouldn't have a problem with marrying outsiders.
Well, she not only has to believe in God, she has to forsake the gods that she's been brought up to believe in. Yeah. And I think that was the reason for the prohibition in the first place, is that you don't marry a foreign woman and you end up taking her gods instead of the other way around.
Then also she's not going to have the same rights as like an Israelite woman.
That's right. That's right. So there's limited things that anybody who joins the house of Israel, Israel was to welcome those folks to do that. It wasn't like they were prohibited from allowing foreigners to come in as long as they were willing to embrace Yahweh. But there were still restrictions as they weren't going to have the full rights of a true Israelite. What's interesting about Ruth is she actually becomes part of the line of David. So
eventually, even though she's not a full Israelite at that point, at some point, somewhere down the line, they become a full Israelite.
that's right. And that's largely because being a full Israelite is through the man's side. It's through, the seed of David. The seed of Abraham, I should say. All right, so the whole family goes down to Moab. The men take Moabite wives. The wives end up dying. Elimelech dies first. And so all three ladies are widows. How long are they down in Moab? 10 years. And then they hear that the Lord has visited Israel. In other words, he has rescued them and brought food back, and they travel back up to Bethlehem. And at that point, Naomi herself ends up encouraging her daughter-in-laws to go back to their gods. And what is her rationale for that?
They're not going to get a husband
Exactly.
or a family.
Exactly. She says, one, I'm old, I'm not going to be able to get another husband. And two, even if I did and I had sons, and that would be the custom, is that, there'd be husbands from her, then you shouldn't have to wait until those sons come of age and marry. Go back to your own people. Basically, she's urging them to remarry and go back to their own lives. One of the daughters-in-law is willing to do that. Ruth is not. And it's a great commitment that she has to Naomi. This is often used out of context to talk about the marriage commitment between a husband and a wife. There's good application there, but this is actually a commitment from daughter-in-law Ruth to her mother-in-law Naomi. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." So she's very much making commitment to the Israelite nation there. And as we read the rest of the story, it's clear that commitment is genuine and true. She even goes on to say, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." So at that point, Naomi is willing to have Ruth come back with her. In the second chapter, we see Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi. How does she demonstrate that?
Going to work.
She goes to work, and she goes to a kind of work that would have been difficult. God had made provision in the law so that when somebody harvested their field, they weren't to harvest all the corners, and they were to leave a certain amount left so that people were in this kind of situation. And they're in a very difficult situation because they don't have a husband or a man to provide for them, a husband or a son. And that's what this provision in the law was. It was people in this kind of situation that could go out and glean in the fields after the main harvest had taken place and get food just enough to eke out a living and enough to get by. So Ruth is willing to do that for Naomi, and it just so happens, the text says, we know this by God's providence, that Naomi ends up in the field of Boaz. That Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. Naomi did not tell her to go there, but that's where she ends up. And then when Ruth comes back and tells Naomi, she recognizes, hey, this is one of our relatives, one of our closest relatives. Boaz also hears about or finds out that Ruth has come to glean in his fields, and he inquires about her. He's already heard about her and the commitment that she'd made to Naomi and all that she had done to care for her. So not only does he let her glean, but he says, look, don't go in any other field. Just stay here in my field, because there was a danger of going out into these fields. You don't know what could happen. She could have been assaulted by one of the men. He's trying to protect her, and he's also sending extra food by her back to Naomi. So that's what Ruth does as a service to Naomi. And then we get to chapter 3. We see Naomi wanting to provide for Ruth. And the way that she does that, she finds out that she's been gleaning in Boaz's field. She recognizes that Boaz is a potential kinsman redeemer for them. And she tells Ruth, look, get yourself clean, go down to the threshing floor, make yourself known to Boaz. And there's people that have said, what's going on here? What happened down there at the threshing floor? I think it was just an opportunity for her to go down when Boaz was by himself. Naomi particularly says, wait until after he's ate and drank for the evening and lays down, uncover his feet. I think she just did that to wake him up, basically. And that's what happens in the night. And Ruth makes a very direct appeal to him. I'm part of your family, or you're a kinsman redeemer for us. You cover your maiden. Basically, she's making an appeal to him for him to marry her. And he is willing to do that. Boaz, we have a number of righteous characters in this story, and Boaz is one of them as well. He says in chapter 3, verse 10, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men. Boaz was evidently an older man, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I'll do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And now it's true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Boaz is obviously following the law. He recognizes, yes, I'm a kinsman redeemer, but there's one in the line ahead of me, and he's going to go through the proper procedure to make sure that he does things right. So again, he sends Ruth back with 6 measures of barley, and Naomi is thrilled at what's taken place. And she says to Ruth, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. Finally, we get to chapter 4, Ruth's redemption by Boaz.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Do you think he was married before?
Okay, very good question.
Or do you think he had multiple wives and they just don't say it?
Yes, I think it's very likely that he was married before. And I say that because, I had the same kind of concept, a similar kind of concept, in what's called a levirate marriage. When a man died, he'd not had any children yet, and his brother was responsible to marry the woman and raise up seed to his dead brother. Well, I don't think that in every case the man would have been single when that happened. And the reason that they wanted this to be this way was so that the land would stay in one clan and stay in the same family. So I think it would be very unusual for Boaz not to have been married. Now, his wife could have died. We're not told. He was an older man. But I don't think even if he was married that would have prevented him from doing what he did. He's basically marrying Ruth as a protection for them as a family, and in order for their land to be able to stay in their family. This is always a question, but again, you've just got instances in the Old Testament where people have multiple wives. The very father of the nation, Jacob, had the 12 tribes by 4 different women. David had multiple wives. At some point along the way, that changed, and it was only you were only to have one wife, and you see that especially with the elders in the New Testament. But the law even regulates in the Old Testament, if a man has 2 wives and one is loved and the other is unloved, and the firstborn belongs to the unloved wife, then you can't deny the rights of the firstborn on that basis. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I don't think he necessarily would have been single when he married her. It was a safety net. It was a safety net for situations like this when a husband or when a wife lost her husband. And you can imagine that would have taken place a lot in Israel, especially during the times of warfare.
I'm just not used to thinking of marriages being so utilitarian.
No, but you kind of get that impression in the Old Testament. It is. And that's really the key, is it's a different culture, a different time. There's certain things as you read through the progress of God's revelation that change over time. Go all the way back to the beginning. Men had to marry their sisters in order for the world to be populated. Over time, that became prohibited. In the same way, I think over time it became one man and one wife, whereas it wasn't a sin to have multiple wives. I don't think so. Now, not everybody agrees with that, but I don't think it was a sin for men to have multiple wives in the Old Testament. It was always a sin to take somebody else's wife. That's what David had done with Bathsheba, but not to have multiple wives. Kings especially had them. All right, chapter 4. Let me go back here, sorry. Ruth's redemption by Boaz, an important descendant. There's this procedure. They always, when the elders have something they're going to decide in the city, they gather at the city gate. Boaz recognizes, and he calls the man that has the first right of redemption to this land and the woman that goes with it. And the man initially is willing to take the land, but once he finds out he has to take Ruth as well, he backs out. He says, you redeem it. And so Boaz does. They exchange sandals as an attestation to the transaction that's occurred. And it seems that the people are very happy. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home," speaking of Ruth here, "like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord shall give you by this young woman." So again, there's hope. There's hope even for Naomi, because now she not only has Boaz as somebody that can take care of them in the immediate future, she has prospects of descendants and of a son that they'll be able to keep the land in their family, and they'll be able to, have people to work that land and get the food from it.
Can I ask about that process?
Yes.
Did they have to, when he said he was willing to take the land, did he have to buy it from somebody? Or was he just taking it and gonna take care of it? And why would he want the land but not her? He just didn't want the issue of having another wife, or?
I think the other man says that he doesn't want to take it because he's afraid it's going to jeopardize his inheritance. Now, that's a good question. We're not told exactly how, but it does seem that his taking of the wife, and maybe it jeopardizes in the sense of, if he has children by Ruth, then perhaps those children are trying to make claim on the inheritance that was just originally his. And you can imagine there might be enmity between the sons that came through Ruth and the sons that came through his first wife. So, but to get to your first question, there were instances where they would have to pay somebody if the land had already been sold. It seems here that he is actually acquiring the land without having to pay money for it, because nobody else has bought it. And we'll look at the scriptures in Leviticus that point to where that kinsman redeemer comes into play.
So maybe this is another dumb question, and maybe it's just a cultural thing, but why couldn't they just, if they didn't have to buy the land back, why couldn't they just live on the land then too? Did they just have to have a male own it?
Well, to live on the land, basically you have to be able to farm it. And
I mean, she can clearly look thick. Maybe
She-
she could also,
well, I think the idea is that the man is going to do the bulk of that work. Now, it doesn't mean that the women wouldn't do any, because Ruth had been able to glean. But if you're thinking about all that's involved in a full-blown harvest, all she was doing was gleaning. You're not going to be able. You have to have somebody to work the land.
legally they couldn't, it was not just legally, or could they not legally just own the land?
Well, they could own it, because he had the daughters, remember? They came to Moses.
They could own it, but
So
they-
just didn't think they could take care of it.
They'd have to be able to work it and basically get the food out of it.
Okay.
And I think that's what they didn't think they could do without
She's
workers.
older, she's just one person. so-
That's right.
okay.
That's right. So what are the major themes in Ruth? Redemption, particularly redemption by the kinsman redeemer.
Providence of God.
Providence of God. He brought Ruth into this field of the next closest relative to be a kinsman redeemer.
I don't know how to say this, but there's like still people who are doing it right, even though during the time of the judges, most people weren't. Like, I guess
Very
they're remnant.
important theme. It's a very important theme. Because how does the book of Ruth end? What is the real purpose in the book of Ruth?
The genealogy of Jesus, or
So say-
Not of Jesus, of
For
David.
David.
Of David. And again, if this was written after the fact that David had become king, this story tells the truth that even during a period as dark as the days of the judges, there were still godly people. There was still a godly remnant. And from such a family as this came King David. So again, there's hope despite the darkness of this period overall. Let me just throw up some more up here. Sovereignty, Charles says, sovereignty and providence of God. You can say that about almost every Bible book, but it is seen explicitly here in Ruth. God's grace and mercy to both individuals and to Israel as a whole. Godly characters in the midst of an evil generation. We see three of them in this book by itself. And then this concept of the kinsman redeemer. Now I want us to look quickly at the scriptures that talk about this. In Leviticus 25, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes poor and he has to sell part of his property, and again, I think they would probably sell the property in order to be able to buy food if they couldn't work the land themselves, then the nearest kinsman is to come and to buy back what his relative has sold. So they would have to pay a price if the land had already been sold. Leviticus, and down in verses 47 and 49, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you become sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. So usually you did have to pay a price. In this case, it seems Naomi had come back and she was able to be redeemed by her kinsman. He just had to negotiate with the other guy that was in line ahead of him to be able to take the land and take the woman that went with it. Donna really hit on the purpose of the message already, but let me just throw some final comments up there. The book ends with a genealogy of David and thus highlights God's sovereignty and providence in bringing out the birth of his king, even against large obstacles, even against a very ungodly generation. And this is a comment by two commentators named Hill and Walton. The Judges period that provided the setting was notorious for its apostasy and covenantal ignorance and offense. Faith was at a premium. That is, as you read through the book of Judges, you wonder if anybody in the whole nation is living a godly life, is following the Lord. How did the faith of Israel survive? We suggest that it survived in the common folk, such as Elimelech and Naomi. The overall picture was glum, but there were faithful individuals. This issue is not without significance for the reader's understanding of David. As the historical narratives move from the Judges period to the monarchy, and that's where we'll move next week. Matt will begin teaching for us in Samuel. David can be viewed with great incredulity. How could faith like this exist after 400 years of conditions such as those described in the book of Judges? The story of Ruth, drawn from David's ancestry, offers an explanation of the survival of faith. The message is that God preserved families of faith, and that from one such family King David came. So you kind of see that through all the books that we've looked at already. You have this apostasy by the majority on the one hand, even though they were put in a position where you would think, boy, it'd be great if most of the nation was faithful and just a small remnant was unfaithful. That's not the way it is. It's not been the way it's been through all of Israel's history. It's the same in the book of Judges. Most of the people are apostate, but you've got a remnant of godly people within that, and Ruth tells that story. Again, I know we've said this before, but when the new covenant kicks in for Israel, that is what changes. Is that the whole nation is faithful at that point, whereas up to this point in time, it's only been a small portion that's been faithful. And their faithfulness makes for great blessing for the whole world. All right, so next week, Matt will kick off Samuel for us, and he'll do Samuel through Esther, right? I think that's the plan. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So we'll move through the books of the monarchy and the books of the restoration, what we're calling the historical books in the English canon.